How's it going, everybody? This is Juansgalt with Crypto TV, and this is part 2 of the UASF series that I am working on. I've got no other than JW Weatherman, usually known as the one guy that wears the Chewbacca mask. He is a threat analyst, a cybersecurity expert, I think you could say. I mean, he probably would call himself that, and he seriously knows what he's talking about. And I interviewed him at the Parallelipolis Crypto Anarchy Institute at the Hackers Congress. He gave a killer speech there about basically how to destroy Bitcoin for loss and pain, you know, and it was a really great presentation. Here you can watch it on the Parallelipolis YouTube channel. So here we're talking about UASF, and he's got a really interesting perspective that actually surprised me, where he thinks that he's skeptical as to how useful the UASF itself was. And in part he says that he wasn't there, like he didn't experience it like some of us did. Like he wasn't in it, you know, it wasn't that emotional, kind of like an intense experience for him, because he was just actually getting in, and then he kind of like started after the fact, that after he did like a threat analysis for Bitcoin. So he's got a bit of more of a distant perspective from it, but he's got some interesting points about maybe it all didn't quite play out the way we felt it, right? So anyway, great conversation. We go into more depth about UASF, and he makes the case that Bitmain was trying to become Bitcoin's central bank, which there's certainly a strong case for. So let me know what you think. I think this is a really good conversation. Appreciate him coming on the show. Check out his YouTube channel, JW Weatherman, on YouTube. And apologize for there's a little bit of a background noise at the beginning. My mic was rubbing against my jacket, but it gets a lot better about 2 minutes in. Thank you. Enjoy. Tell the world. Tell everybody. Bye. Were you following the user-activated soft fork and the Bitcoin Cash fork that happened last year?
You know, I came in sort of at the tail end of all of that, or maybe it was like while it was happening, but I didn't really know what was going on until I finished the threat model. And I did that in November, and I think it was all pretty much resolved by then, if I remember it. But
okay.
it was it was a lot it was definitely drinking from the fire hose at that point.
Yeah, well, it was a really fascinating event, and I'm hoping to start a conversation with people to get a clearer picture on what happened back then, because I think I've been in this space for a few years, and as far as events in the crypto space, I feel like this is maybe the most important one as far as teaching us how Bitcoin's consensus works, and how to deal with it at the social level when there's a significant sort of fork. Do you feel like you're sort of knowledgeable enough, or have some knowledge on UASF that you'd like to kind of explore with me?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in some ways I have the advantage of not having lived it, so I can look back at sort of the main mountain peaks a little bit more clearly. So with Bitcoin Cash, essentially what was going on is it was after the SegWit 2x effort, right? And the SegWit 2x effort was to introduce a security flaw into Bitcoin, which was dangerously large blocks that would have caused more miner centralization. It was also an attempt to retain a security flaw called transaction malleability. And transaction malleability being fixed allowed for layer 2 technologies, and that's great. But it until it was fixed, it allowed for covert ASIC boost as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that was what SegWit 2x was all about. When they
and it's interesting to pause there for a moment, because that's something that would benefit Bitmain. And then as you mentioned in your presentation, Jeff Garcic was involved with that, and there's the whole Bitcoin, like the big blocker sort of perspective. So they were kind of rallying that momentum, that sort of, let's say, populist sort of marketing momentum, and the reputation of Roger Ver and everything. So there's a lot of energy behind it, and a lot of people that were kind of, you know, on that side. So it makes you wonder how these kind of coincidental alliances happen.
Yeah, with the benefit of hindsight, I think it's pretty obvious that Bitmain had a few things going on. One is that they weren't doing very well competing in building new miners. So in hindsight, it's obvious that Bitmain, they were really struggling as a business. They have not been able to produce new miners, and they could see that there was a lot of new competition coming in. Building mining hardware is super competitive, and it's going to be like everything that's very competitive. It's going to be very hard to make a profit. So I think they could see that on the horizon pretty clearly at this point. And we now know that they went in really, really hard on Bitcoin Cash. And we also have really good reason to believe that they were using covert ASIC boost and that was a big part of their profits. There's a lot, I mean, there's hundreds of millions of dollars on the line just with covert ASIC boost. But also if with the miner centralization issue, from there, I believe that what was going on, and this is a little bit of guesswork, but I believe what was going on is they could see that if they could get the blocks big enough to cause miner centralization, this would allow them to have control of Bitcoin essentially. And if they believe Bitcoin is actually, functional, then it's not a stretch to say they thought that they could end up being the new Federal Reserve, like the new global Federal Reserve. And if there's that sort of potential, it makes sense to take some really absurdly large risks. That said, in hindsight, also, I think it's really obvious that they never had the potential to do that. So to go back to SegWit2x, so these two bugs they wanted to introduce, they were unsuccessful. The one security bug got fixed with SegWit, and they were not able to get in the other one of dangerously large blocks. So then it's pretty obvious that they pivoted, and they went with Bitcoin Cash, and Bitcoin Cash being an exact copy of Bitcoin, but with those security flaws in it. And then if they could actually get Bitcoin Cash to be adopted, their thought was, right, if they can make Bitcoin Cash the real Bitcoin, this is a different way to pull off the same thing, right? They get their miner centralization, they get control of the new global money. What's kind of sad about it is that they never had a chance, right? They spent all of these hundreds of millions of dollars, and no matter how this played out, they were going to lose. Let's look at what actually happened. What actually happened is investors were not deceived to any great degree, and they ended up with all these worthless tokens. And they're basically, I would say they're probably, on the order of magnitude of bankrupt, right? They're no longer a successful, flourishing business. Doesn't mean that a lot of investors can't bring the name back to life, but as far as I'm concerned, it's over for Bitmain, and they're starting from scratch. But let's say that it had gone the other way. Let's say that 85% of the investors had been tricked and had either embraced the security flaw, before through SegWit2x or through Bitcoin Cash. It doesn't matter. It's just names. But let's say that there was a chain that had those two security flaws in it, and then there was another chain that rejected it, right? So we have maybe 15% of the people say, no, I'm not accepting dangerously large blocks, and I want transaction malleability fixed. So they're the SegWit chain, and then you have the non-SegWit chain. Even if 85% of the investors had gone with that, over time, they would have more hash power, sure. But because that flaw exists, eventually it would become known that flaw exists, right? You can't hide information from the market forever. And what that would mean is that eventually investors would move from the non-SegWit chain to the SegWit chain as they realized that it didn't have the potential to become global cash. So all it would have done is really just even more rewarded the SegWit people, right? Like the people that sold their Bitcoin Cash and got rid of that garbage right off the bat were rewarded by the market for identifying those security flaws. But imagine if they were the 15% minority and identified those security flaws. They would have done far better. So in the end, these flaws were eventually, you can't hide a security software flaw forever. And that would have been reflected in the market price.
Yeah, let's talk about how that attack was stopped, which I find maybe the most fascinating about this. Obviously, Bitmain was behind both Bitcoin Cash and SegWit2x, as we just discussed. The way that the Bitcoin Core's community, let's say, defended against it, there's a third sort of layer of attack, which was that the GitHub repo, the let's say the coding consensus would be moved either to SegWit2x or to Bitcoin Cash, and it's a separate group of developers with a separate sort of strategy for sort of getting the best code to rise, if that's the goal, or at least the code that they want to rise. And so that would have actually even taken power from this sort of open source environment where Bitcoin has sort of been created out of. So that's another layer of it. Now, the way that Bitcoin Core defended against this And I don't know exactly how this came about, but somebody published a spec for what we know now as the user activated software, or UASF. And this is a very interesting piece of code that people could upgrade their node to support. And it had the equivalent of saying, okay, well, if we're going to go to war, we're going to go to war, and we're going to make this very difficult for everybody until we potentially win. Let's talk a little bit about that. What do you know about sort of the origin of UASF? And let's maybe tell us kind of what's your recollection of your research of how that played out.
Yeah, so I think this actually, if right, I think this area is particularly helpful for me to have not lived through it. From what I can tell, it was a very emotional experience for everybody, and there was a lot of fear and uncertainty and frustration, and it resulted in this UASF sort of, let's call it, movement. But for me, looking back on it, all of that stuff seems kind of stupid. Like, at the end of the day, people were going to run either secure code or insecure code. So we were going to end up with a SegWit fork and a non-SegWit fork. And you know, the campaign itself, I think it was good. Like, I think it was a good educational campaign, but I don't think that it was going to, I don't think it mattered beyond that, right? At the end of the day, if people understood that these were security flaws and not to be embraced, they weren't going to run that code. And whether there was a chunk of code that said, hey, we're going to totally, you know, we're totally going to fork, or we're going to, you know, sort of force the hand of this split or whatever. I mean, all of that seems like it's been way blown out of proportion, at least for me looking back on it, because, yeah, I mean, I get that people went through a really intense time, but
yeah,
man, at the end of the day, smart people were going to run code that didn't have those security flaws, and they were going to buy the digital asset that didn't have those security flaws. Dumb people, you know, the libertarian, technical illiterate in the United States, they were going to run dumb software. And so everything else seems kind of like a less significant footnote to me.
Yeah, so the reason I find this particularly interesting is that it may, like, depending on how we interpret those events, is how we will think that Bitcoin's sort of consensus, sort of deeper layers of consensus security work. So the narrative that I have in my mind, the what I experienced, what I perceived during those events was that the attack vectors that you laid out, that's basically what I saw. And then the defense was, okay, we're going to run something called the user activated soft fork. There's two versions. One was the most popular. And with this soft fork, they would say, well, anybody that's running the US user activated soft fork, we will reject blocks that are A, bigger than 1 megabyte, and B, that don't have SegWit built into it. And the flag day is on, I believe it was like the end of August or the beginning of August, maybe August the 1st. And that was sort of like the line on the sand. And if the hashing power, the majority of hashing power was on SegWit 2x for a while, and then it eventually flowed back to Bitcoin Core, then all the transaction histories, all the transactions that have been made on SegWit 2x would be reorged, and essentially, like, history would go back in time and start reforming on the new one, and people would potentially lose money if they bet on SegWit 2x. How's that recollection?
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. I mean, it kind of forced the issue to happen on a specific date. I'm not sure that it really did. It seems like the UASF guys that were really involved are sure that was the reason. You know, the SegWit 2x guys are some taking credit for it too, even though they were clearly the attackers. But I guess at the end of the day, to me, it's really simple, right? Like, what software are you actually running? The whole issue with, like, the GitHub repo and taking control from developers, that was all part of the attacker's narrative. That's stupid. That's not how open source software works. Like, who cared? If we really thought that the GitHub repo or the Git repo that's hosted on GitHub was actually a security critical thing, this whole thing wouldn't make any sense, right? Microsoft has control of that. They can do whatever they want with it. On the other hand, if we thought that somehow the list of, quote, core developers mattered in any way, this would be the stupidest software project, the stupidest security project in the history of the world, because we don't even know who the core developers are, right? This is open source. People pop in, they write a test, they pop out, right? It's this amorphous blob of very porous participants. And the only thing that matters at the end of the day is what software you're running on your mobile phone and you're running on your laptop. So whether the majority of people got tricked, for some period of time, maybe the UASF code pushed the issue forward and like made more of a clean break sort of thing. But at the end of the day, I think it's really obvious in hindsight that the majority of people understood that there were security flaws that needed to be avoided, and they would have ran that code. And if somehow somebody gets control of the GitHub repo, or did get hold of the repo, or started using the core name, it wouldn't have been hard for everybody just to communicate together through all of the different mediums of contact that we have to say, hey, this is the one that has the security flaws fixed. And honestly, there wasn't even any credible engineers on the attacker side, right? So it's not like we tend to have, I think, the wrong impression of the market, partly because of the amount of voices, right? If you go on Twitter, it seems like there's all these people that are really in on XRP and all of this other stuff. But the big money investors, the guys that are actually willing to pay an expert to look into something before they throw money around, they tend to be a little bit more methodical. And I don't think that you were going to see a market for this coin that, honestly, Roger Ver is not the front man that you want if you're going after, big money U.S. investors, which is what's moving the market. So it really, I think, is laughable in hindsight. But I want to be respectful to the people that lived through that and the terror that everybody felt that was deeply invested in Bitcoin. I'm deeply invested emotionally in Bitcoin at this point. So I don't want to make it seem like it was a wasted effort or anything like that. But I do think it's important that we just take a step back and recognize, that may have been a good move, but that's not what did it, right? Bitcoin is actually way more secure than a marketing campaign and a bunch of hats. It's just whatever software you run. And as people become more aware of how this all works, it's going to be all the more easy to maintain its security.
One of the things that, and I appreciate that, I think people that were in experiencing that great civil war of sorts, it's how it felt. It really felt like a civil war. Don't appreciate those comments. One of the things that I found very confusing and very interesting is at the time before the conflict settled, SegWit2x, according to the signaling mechanism, had 80% of the hashing power, or at least the mining pools were signaling support for SegWit2x, and this was because of the New York agreement, and there was some other backstory around the Hong Kong agreement. What is your take on that? Some people say that this signaling, some of that signaling was spoofed. Obviously, it was coming from the mining pools. There was also, I believe, private miners that were signaling for USASF. What is your take on that?
Yeah, that's another. So I think for years people are going to be able to go back and mine this whole incident for false narratives, right? Because this whole idea of miners leading the market in any way, it's just it's an economic misunderstanding of what's happening. Because miners, they're using real world electricity, right? So let's say that they have to spend $10,000 on electricity for every Bitcoin block that they find. That's real stuff, right? That the whole model of Bitcoin is that you have to destroy real things, real valuable things, electrons that have been produced and can power other things, but you're going to burn them up on miners and turn them into heat, right? So that model necessitates that anybody that's doing that activity be able to sell those Bitcoin for basically as much as possible, because it's also very competitive. Anybody can fire up new mining hardware and compete with you. So if you don't, if you sell those things if you sell your Bitcoin blocks for $10,005, or the Bitcoin that you get in the block reward for $10,005, you're doing pretty good actually, because it's a super, super competitive space with zero competitive advantage and anybody can get into it. So you're not going to continue to do that if you can only sell those block rewards for $2,000. You just can't afford to do it. You'll be driven out of business immediately. You're barely able to make it work when you do exactly what investors want you to do. And you know what investors want you to do based on the market price, the current buy orders basically that are sitting out there. So miners are absolutely the slaves of the system. Like, it is the worst business that I think anybody could ever go into, is being a Bitcoin miner. Now, I'm glad that people are doing it, but it is the most competitive thing. It is like you cannot have sort of any kind of competitive advantage. There's zero barrier to entry, and like, your brand name has zero value, right? Like, if you've been in business for 15 years as a miner, nobody cares. It's not even interesting, right? So it is absolutely cutthroat. It's totally tough. And you are the most slave to the consumer, right? Like, this is a business where you are the slave to the consumer more than any other business in the history of the freaking world. So the idea that these guys could do anything other than kiss the butt of every consumer that wants to buy the Bitcoin that they mine is absolutely retarded. It's the stupidest narrative ever. But they were able to sell that, and as a result, they were able to sell miner signaling. But at the end of the day, what it comes down to again is, if investors are running SegWit software and they're buying SegWit coins, to use Roger Ver's disparaging term, then the miners are going to be forced to either rapidly go out of business, which is great, because then what are they going to do? If they go out of business, they're going to sell their miners to try to recover their losses as much as possible to somebody else that's not stupid enough to mine a coin that's less valuable. So one way or another, all those miners were going to be running, and they were going to be running the coin that the investors wanted them to run. And in hindsight, it's really clear that investors wanted them to run SegWit. It could have taken a while, right? If investors were fully deceived, maybe 85% of those miners would have needed to mine Bitcoin Cash for a while. But eventually, investors would have woken up to this security flaw. And again, a security flaw is only valuable if you exploit it, right? So at some point, the Bitcoin Cash guys were going to be exploiting that flaw. We saw them exploit the hell out of the difficulty adjustment flaw.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And obviously, investors knew what was going on. They were going, "Good grief, this is not good for me. I don't want to own this asset anymore."
Yeah, it was brutal. I mean, they were mining like 40 blocks a day for the first 2 to 3 days, most of which were likely Bitmain, and that, well, we've seen the hilarious results. Really, the loser of the war loses big time, and I think we were on the right side on this time.
No, the only real investor. I mean, I don't know how many other investors there are in Bitcoin Cash. Roger Ver did an excellent job of getting all kinds of suckers to say, "I'll accept a Bitcoin Cash." But I believe that almost all of those businesses that are saying, "Yeah, I'm anti-war.com and I'm stupid, so I'll accept Bitcoin Cash," partly because there's a matching donation, right, from Roger Ver that's coming in.
Yeah.
But those guys immediately took that Bitcoin Cash and they sold. They were not investing in it. So I don't know. I mean, it'll be really interesting if we can ever find this out. Maybe Bitmain is the ones that got stuck with the whole bag, right? Like, are there really a lot of people that invested real resources, real Bitcoin, real electricity in these stupid pieces of garbage? Or is Bitmain just, the attacker and the victim? It seems like that's definitely true to some degree.
Yeah, to probably a large degree, and the fall of Bitmain is quite a thing to see with this context. Thank you so much, Mr. J. Weatherman. It's been a great conversation. I'll be publishing this, and looking forward to people's comments. I want to definitely kind of do a post-mortem on UASF and try to understand what went down better, because this will help us be more educated and more prepared for the next few conflicts that are bound to come. One of them is, at least Adam Back is saying that the next great debate is going to be around privacy. What do you see as the next great sort of debate, even if it's superfluous?
I don't know. I was really surprised that there was the proof of work change attack. And it was, so I think there's kind of two different ways that I bounce back and forth. Like, one is that the attackers are ignorant, but then once I start interacting with them, I kind of realize that they're almost always malicious, and almost always more connected to each other than you would think. So I think there is quite a bit of sort of mutual conspiracy with these guys. But the proof of work change attempt that Cobra and Luke Dash Jr. pushed a while back was really surprising to me, because that would absolutely obliterate Bitcoin security. And it, in hindsight, it didn't get a whole lot of support. But I would say that it was shocking that two very prominent people, and basically good assets on the board, let's say, right? Like these are not just pawns. These are guys that have a strong reputation. We're willing to burn that on something like that. So I hope that's a sign that the attacks are going to get more and more desperate, but it wouldn't surprise me if we saw some sort of renewed effort around either environmentalism or something else, saying that we need to change the proof of work and destroy ourselves. Even though it didn't work, there's still a very disturbing underlying narrative that most of the investment community seems, from what I can tell, to have bought into. And that is that a proof of work change is a nuclear option. So what I could see happening, and the way that I would exploit this if I was an attacker, is I would probably, for a short period of time, be able to spend the money to get a 51% attack and maybe do some censoring or do some double spends. It's not very expensive on a short-term basis, but if you could use that, which are really not very important attacks, in order to justify a proof of work change, because we can get the community to pull the nuclear option, that would be a really interesting attack. And that analogy is really dangerous, because it's not a nuclear option. The nuclear option is, you destroy the enemy brutally, and maybe they don't have a chance to launch their nukes. This is where you point the nukes at your own city. You just obliterate yourself. Once
you destroy the market.
Well, yeah, you destroy the market, but you also destroy the security of Bitcoin. If we woke up tomorrow and we were all on a non-ASIC hard algorithm, then anybody that feels like investing in ASICs will own all of the Bitcoin network. And we can't do that. The whole point is we need to run our network at the cutting edge of human capability to remain secure. So giving that up, that is something that could not only destroy Bitcoin, but could potentially mean that we'll never have a chance to create another digital government hard money again. So I'm definitely watching that one. The drive chains thing, I think that's going to be interesting how that plays out next year. As far as privacy goes, I think, I don't know. I don't think it's going to be quite as big of a battle, especially because we can solve so many privacy problems on layer 2. And I think that at this point, especially given the fact that we don't have 100% code coverage in testing in Bitcoin, and we've seen bugs that are, recently that are pretty disturbing as a result of that. I think we'd be way better off just making our focus on keeping things running and letting things happen on layer 2. Schnorr and other stuff like that's pretty cool, but I'm trying to, at least myself, be disciplined and not be excited about that, because I want to be excited that it hasn't fallen over and that we've increased test coverage by 3% in the last 6 months.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your perspective and your work. You're definitely doing deep analysis, and I can see people are finding it very educational. Your presentation just now was a total success here at the Parallel Polis Hackers Congress. So yeah, thank you for your time. I'm sure we could have many conversations, and that this will probably be welcomed by people.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Yeah, actually, let me plug my class for anybody that's interested.
Yeah.
So I've got I did a class that I released a while back. I had about 40 students go through it, and Eric Lombroso and Saifedean Amos showed up and did Q&A sessions. But I've retooled it because it was really hard to get all that scheduling to happen. So now it's basically 3 hours of lecture that's self-study, and then you get access to some other stuff. But one of the things that I do is every 2 weeks, I do a live stream 2-hour Q&A session with all of the students, and any student can show up and ask questions that they want. So if you're interested in taking that class, that's probably the main thing that I've done, other than the Bitcoin threat model, to try to inoculate the Bitcoin community from a lot of these threats and help investors get up to speed. And you can check that out by going to jwweatherman.com/class, CLASS.
And this is different than the math bots, where you teach kids how to learn math by programming robots.
Yeah. So that's another project that that I'm working on. If you go to mathbot.com, you can play the game. The basic idea is we're going to reward kids with Bitcoin. So if you have a kid or a grandkid or just a kid in the neighborhood that you care about, you can buy something like algebra or division or arithmetic for $50. And then as the kids program the robot at mathbot.com, and pass math levels, master math topics, in addition to programming topics, then they'll get a little bit of Bitcoin in their account that they can, go buy candy with or something.
That's great. That's great. Thanks so much for your work, man.
Absolutely. Thanks for taking the time. It was a great chat.
Yeah. Take care.